At its peak in the 1890s, 1 in every 200 Americans was addicted to opiates. That's 3 times higher than the crack epidemic of the 90s. 3 times. The drug responsible? You could buy it at the general store next to the flour. No prescription needed, no questions asked. It cost less than beer. Your great-grandmother probably used it. This is the story of how America forgot its first opioid crisis, and why that amnesia killed 450,000 people. Picture yourself walking into a pharmacy in 1890. Boston, San Francisco, a small town in Kansas, doesn't matter. Behind the counter, you'll find rows of bottles, reddish-brown liquid, glass stoppers, labels that promise miracles, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for your crying baby, Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound for women's troubles, Dr. Hartman's Peruna for whatever ails you. You don't need to see a doctor. You don't need a prescription. You can order it from the Sears catalogue and have it delivered by mail. A child can walk to the corner store with a note and a few pennies and buy enough to keep their mother unconscious for a week. The active ingredient in most of these products was laudanum, 10% opium dissolved in alcohol, 1% pure morphine. The rest was marketing. By 1905, Americans were spending $75 million a year on patent medicines. That's over $2 billion in today's money. The industry was massive, and it was built almost entirely on addiction. One company, just one, sold 1.5 million bottles of baby medicine in a single year. Each bottle contained 65 milligrams of morphine per ounce, enough, as the American Medical Association would later determine, to kill the average child in a single teaspoon. They called it soothing syrup. Everyone else called it the baby killer. The man who sold it became a millionaire. If you think this is just history, consider this. In the late 1990s, Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin with a marketing campaign claiming less than 1% addiction risk. They hired over 5,000 doctors to give talks. They funded patient advocacy groups. They told Congress that concerns about addiction were overblown. Every single one of those tactics, every target demographic, every reassurance, every lobbying strategy had been used in the 1890s. The corporate executives had MBAs from Wharton. They had access to libraries. They knew this history, and they did it anyway. We'll get there, but first you need to understand how it worked the first time. In 1849, a woman named Charlotte Winslow, a nurse and midwife, created a formula to help teething babies. Her son-in-law, Jeremiah Curtis, saw an opportunity. He partnered with a man named Benjamin Perkins. Together, they turned Charlotte's home remedy into a business. We're about to watch a man become a millionaire by killing babies. And here's what makes this story urgent. He died wealthy, respected, buried under an impressive monument in the Bronx. He was never arrested, never charged, never apologized. The pattern didn't start with the Sacklers. So how did this happen? Not just the drug, the system that protected it for 50 years. Over 100 bills were introduced in Congress to regulate these medicines between 1879 and 1906. Every single one failed. The answer involves your local newspaper, a clause printed in red ink, and a conspiracy so effective that it took a muckraking journalist and a meatpacking scandal to finally break it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start with what laudanum actually was, and why 19th century doctors called it God's own medicine. The word laudanum comes from the Latin laudare, meaning to praise. It was coined in the 16th century by a Swiss physician and alchemist named Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. History knows him as Paracelsus. Paracelsus was a revolutionary. He wanted to dismantle the old medical orthodoxy of humours and bloodletting in favour of chemistry, the application of chemical principles to medicine. He carried a sword with a pommel that was rumoured to contain his arcanum, a secret pill or elixir he claimed could cure any ailment. His original laudanum recipe was pure Renaissance theatre. 25% opium mixed with crushed pearls, musk, amber, and gold. In his worldview, these ingredients weren't just decorative. Gold imparted solar vitality, pearls offered lunar purity, but the truth was simple. The efficacy of the mixture relied entirely on the alkaloids of the opium poppy. Paracelsus had essentially wrapped the most potent pain reliever known to man in expensive mysticism. The laudanum we recognize, the one that saturated America, came from an English physician named Thomas Sydenham. In 1676, Sydenham published his formulation. He recognized that the gold and pearls were medically useless and economically prohibitive. His recipe was pure pragmatism. 2 ounces of granulated opium dissolved in a pint of sherry wine, seasoned with saffron, cinnamon, and cloves to mask the intensely bitter taste. This formulation, Sydenham's laudanum, became the gold standard for over 2 centuries. It typically contained approximately 10% opium by weight, which equals roughly 1% morphine. The choice of alcohol as a solvent was critical. The ethanol not only extracted the alkaloids from the plant matter but also acted as a preservative, allowing the tincture to be stored indefinitely on the shelves of apothecaries and later general stores. This stability was the key to its commodification. Unlike raw opium, which could dry out or degrade, laudanum was a shelf-stable, liquid commodity that could be bottled, branded, and shipped across the globe. Sydenham, known as the English Hippocrates, declared that medicine would be a cripple without it. For 2 centuries, he was right. Medical textbooks from 1813 to 1858 identified approximately 150 distinct ailments for which opiates were indicated: diarrhea, coughs, nervous disorders, chronic pain, dysentery, insomnia, menstrual cramps. The list went on. Benjamin Franklin took opium late in life for a bladder stone. Alexander Hamilton was given laudanum after his fatal duel with Aaron Burr in 1804. Thomas Jefferson grew white opium poppies at Monticello. The drug was remarkably accessible. At 1 penny for 20 drops, laudanum cost less than gin or beer. Standard formulations contained that 10% powdered opium plus 48% alcohol. A single bottle from the local druggist could transform moderate pain into oblivion, or, with continued use, into what victims called opium slavery. Here's what made laudanum different from modern opioids. It wasn't just morphine, it was whole opium, containing the full spectrum of alkaloids found in the poppy latex: morphine for pain relief and sedation, codeine for cough suppression, essential for treating tuberculosis and bronchitis, papaverine to relax smooth muscle, effective for dysentery and menstrual cramps, the bane adding a subtle stimulant effect, noscapine for further respiratory suppression. This entourage effect made laudanum significantly different from pure morphine. The presence of multiple alkaloids moderated the effects, and the high alcohol content, often 45 to 90%, added a layer of intoxication that synergized with the opiates. A dose of laudanum was a double hit of depressants that could render a patient unconscious or induce a dreamlike, hypnagogic state often romanticized by writers of the era. The physical properties were distinct: a reddish-brown, viscous liquid with a taste so bitter it was described as acrid and nauseating. This bitterness was a natural deterrent to overdose, but in the Gilded Age, it was aggressively masked by the sugar and molasses used in patent medicines, transforming a potent medical tincture into a palatable, lethal syrup. By the mid-19th century, laudanum had become so embedded in American life that its presence was invisible. It was the aspirin of the era, but it was also the tranquilizer, the antidepressant, the sleeping pill. It was the chemical infrastructure of a society undergoing the traumatic transition from agrarian rhythms to the frenetic pace of industrial modernity. And then came the Civil War. The American Civil War created the conditions for an epidemic. The Union Army medical staff alone issued nearly 10 million opium pills plus 2.8 million ounces of opium powders and tinctures to soldiers Confederate medical handbooks declared opium as important to the surgeon as gunpowder to the ordnance. Laudanum was the primary treatment for dysentery and diarrhea, diseases that killed more soldiers than bullets. It was also used for pain from amputations, gunshot wounds, and the psychological trauma of watching friends die in trenches. For a soldier writhing in agony with a shattered leg, or suffering from the endless intestinal agony of camp fever, laudanum was salvation. But it was a technological innovation. The hypodermic syringe, introduced to America in 1856, that transformed casual opium use into devastating morphine addiction. Injected morphine offered immediate relief that oral laudanum couldn't match. The drug hit the bloodstream in seconds, bypassing the digestive system entirely. Doctors initially believed this was a breakthrough. They thought that injecting morphine directly would bypass the stomach and thus avoid the appetite or addiction associated with oral laudanum. They were catastrophically wrong. By the end of the 1870s, virtually every American physician had a hypodermic syringe. Though it could cure little, it could relieve anything. Doctors and patients alike were tempted to overuse. Veterans returned home with what contemporaries called soldier's disease, opium slavery, or morphine mania. One anonymous veteran described his post-war struggle in 1876. Quote, "The doctor soon found he had an elephant on his hands, saw that I was in the habit, became tired of my regular calls for hypodermical injections, and endeavoured me to shake it off." End quote. The doctor's frustration is telling. He had created the addiction with his needle, then blamed the patient for needing it. This was the pattern repeating across thousands of medical practices. Create the dependency, then abandon the patient when the dependency becomes inconvenient. Another case shows what this looked like inside a family. Confederate artillerist John Tackett Gulrick returned from the war with a morphine habit. According to letters preserved at the Virginia Museum of History, his addiction stalked the family for nearly a half-century. His wife wrote to relatives about her husband's disappearances, the money missing from household accounts, the morphine vials hidden throughout the house. She threatened divorce multiple times but never followed through. Victorian society offered no real support for a woman leaving an addicted husband. The family eventually hired nurses to confine Gulrick during withdrawal attempts. He would shake, vomit, hallucinate. The nurses would hold him down, days would pass, and then, inevitably, he would find another vial, another doctor, another way back to the drug. This wasn't recovery. This was torture, and it repeated cyclically until Gulrick's death decades after the war ended. The National Homes for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers tracked this epidemic. Between 1886 and 1896, they documented a 32% annual increase in morphine and opium treatments. Not a 32% increase over the decade, 32% per year. The number of addicted veterans wasn't decreasing as the war receded into memory. It was accelerating. Regional addiction rates varied dramatically. Shreveport, Louisiana, recorded the worst. Almost 10 out of every 1,000 residents addicted to opiates. That's 1% of the entire population. The post-Civil War. South experienced the highest rates in the nation, a combination of battlefield injuries, inadequate medical infrastructure, and the economic devastation that made any form of relief appealing. But there's a detail here that reveals the structural racism of Victorian medicine. Black Southerners appeared rarely in addiction clinics, partly due to racist medical beliefs that they were less sensitive to pain and therefore received fewer prescriptions. The epidemic was racialized from the start, not in who used drugs but in who received medical treatment versus who was simply left to suffer. White veterans got morphine. Black veterans got told to endure. Same war, same injuries, different medicine. Now, Jeremiah Curtis and Benjamin Perkins were watching all of this. The veterans were coming home addicted. Doctors were increasingly willing to prescribe opiates for any ailment. And Curtis realized something crucial. The medical market was saturated. Veterans could get morphine from doctors. But there was another demographic, largely ignored by the medical establishment, that represented an enormous untapped market: women and their children. Here's where the story breaks your understanding of drug addiction. Between 56 and 71% of opiate addicts in late 19th century America were women. Not poor women living on the margins. Middle-class women, upper-class women, respectable women who would never touch alcohol but who took their medicine every day. The medical establishment of the era viewed the female body as inherently pathological, dominated by the reproductive system. In 1881, Dr. Frederick Heman Hubbard explained it this way, quote, "Uterine and ovarian complications cause more ladies to fall into the habit than all other diseases combined." End quote. Male doctors prescribed opiates liberally for menstrual cramps, morning sickness, postpartum depression, hysteria, the vapors, menopausal symptoms, and the vague female maladies that Victorian medicine attributed to women's supposedly fragile constitutions. Products marketed as women's friends exploited this. Men, by contrast, were expected to bear pain more stoically. The poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning began taking laudanum around age 15 for a spinal injury and continued for depression and insomnia. She wrote, quote, "I am in a fit of writing, could write all day and night, and long to live by myself for 3 months, in a forest of chestnuts and cedars, in an hourly succession of poetical paragraphs and morphine drafts." End quote. Mary Todd Lincoln's use of paregoric and laudanum for migraines intensified dangerously after her husband's assassination. The pre-Raphaelite artist Elizabeth Siddal died of laudanum overdose in February 1862. But beyond the famous names, there were thousands of anonymous women trapped in the same cycle. A housewife in Ohio prescribed laudanum for menstrual pain. A mother in Georgia given opiates after a difficult childbirth. A widow in Massachusetts taking her medicine for nerves after her husband died in the war. Socially, laudanum served as a respectable alternative to alcohol. In the strict moral code of the Victorian era, a woman drinking whiskey or gin was viewed as depraved. A woman taking her medicine was viewed as a sympathetic invalid. Laudanum was the feminine vice, quiet and domestic, whereas alcohol was loud and public. This gendered dynamic created a massive market that Curtis and Perkins exploited with ruthless efficiency. But they didn't stop with adult women. They went after the children. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was marketed with an idyllic image of a mother cradling a child. The label promised to soothe the child, soften the gums, allay all pain, cure wind colic, and was the best remedy for diarrhea. It was printed in English, German, and French to reach immigrant communities. The formula contained 65 milligrams of morphine sulfate per fluid ounce, plus alcohol, sodium carbonate, and spirits of phenyl. 1 teaspoon, the recommended dosage for older infants, contained enough morphine to kill the average child. But Mrs. Winslow's wasn't alone. The market was flooded with competing products: Godfrey's Cordial, Kopp's Baby's Friend, Dalby's Carminative, Mother Bailey's Quieting Syrup, Street's Infant's Quietness. The names were almost obscene in their honesty. Quietness, as if silence was the goal, not health. A druggist in Manchester, England, testified to health investigators about his sales. He admitted selling half a gallon of Godfrey's Cordial every week, along with 5 to 6 gallons of generic quietness preparations. That's from one shop in one city. Multiply that across England and America, and you're looking at millions of doses per year being given to infants. Contemporary surveys found that in Manchester, 5 out of 6 working-class families used opiates on their children habitually. Not occasionally, habitually. This was normalised, expected. The cost of survival in industrial cities where both parents worked and childcare didn't exist. The syrup induced a deep, comatose sleep. Infants would stop crying, stop moving, stop demanding attention. For working-class mothers employed in factories or domestic service, with no access to childcare, this was a miracle. They could work a 12-hour shift knowing their baby would sleep through it. They could get through the night in an overcrowded tenement without disturbing the other families. Picture that choice. You're a mother in 1880. Your husband works at the docks. You work in a textile mill. You have 3 children under 5. There is no daycare. There is no family leave. There are no labour protections. If you don't work, your family doesn't eat. If you bring a crying baby to work, you're fired. Someone at the factory tells you about Mrs. Winslow's. Just a teaspoon before your shift, the baby will sleep. You'll keep your job. Everyone does it, so you do it. And your baby sleeps, and you keep your job. And maybe your baby is one of the lucky ones who survives. Or maybe one morning, your baby doesn't wake up. The deaths followed a pattern. Thomas Bull's 1854 manual, Hints to Mothers, estimated that 3/4 of all deaths from opium occurred in children under 5. But here's what made it insidious. The mechanism was often starvation rather than direct overdose. Children kept in a state of continued narcotism became disinclined for food. They stopped demanding to be fed. Parents, already overwhelmed, didn't notice the weight loss until it was severe. The children shrank up into little old men, wizened like little monkeys, their bodies consuming themselves while the morphine kept them too sedated to cry for help. Other children simply stopped breathing. The morphine paralyzed the respiratory center in the brain. The infant drifted from sleep into stupor, from stupor into coma, from coma into death. Parents would find them cold in the morning. The doctor would write convulsions or sudden infant death on the certificate. The manufacturer faced no consequences. Registrar General reports in the UK recorded 236 narcotic deaths in infants under 1 year between 1863 and 1867. That's the official count. The real number was certainly higher. Many parents either didn't connect the deaths to the syrup or concealed its use out of shame. Victorian society blamed mothers for infant deaths. Admitting you'd given your baby morphine was admitting guilt. Headlines periodically appeared in newspapers. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, another baby sacrificed. The slaughter of the innocents continues. But the product kept selling. Year after year, decade after decade. Because the newspapers running those headlines were also running Curtis's advertisements. The same papers that reported the deaths took his money to promote the product that caused them. By 1868, Curtis and Perkins were selling 1.5 million bottles annually at 25 cents each. That's $375,000 a year, equivalent to over 11 million today. Jeremiah Curtis became a millionaire, and he was just one player in an industry that was rapidly becoming the most profitable sector of American commerce. By the turn of the 20th century, the patent medicine business was generating tens of millions of dollars annually. Major manufacturing hubs operated in cities like Detroit and New York. Companies like Park, Davis and Company sold official USP Laudanum, but the real volume moved through the unregulated nostrum market. The fortunes built on this trade were staggering, and not just for the patent medicine manufacturers. The global opium supply chain enriched some of America's most prominent families. The British Empire's opium wars with China in the mid-19th century had forced open global markets, but American merchants weren't passive observers. They were active participants. John Jacob Astor, founder of the Astor dynasty, built part of his fortune smuggling Turkish opium into China. The Delano family, ancestors of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, operated ships in the Canton opium trade. Warren Delano II, FDR's grandfather, made his wealth importing opium from Turkey to China, then reinvested those profits in American real estate and industry. These weren't fringe operators. These were the families that would define American aristocracy. Their money, laundered through generations, would fund museums, universities, political campaigns. The opium trade wasn't separate from the Gilded Age economy. It was foundational to it. Domestically, the profit margins on potent medicines were astronomical. Let's break down the economics. A bottle of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup cost approximately 5 cents to produce. Water, cheap grain alcohol, a small amount of morphine, the bottle, the label. The wholesale cost of opium was low because global supply was high. The British were growing it in India. The Ottomans were growing it in Turkey. There was no shortage. That 5-cent product sold for 25 cents retail, a 500% markup. But even that understates the profit, because the real expense was advertising, not production. Curtis and Perkins spent fortunes on newspaper ads, but those ads generated such high sales volume that the return on investment was massive. By 1868, Curtis and Perkins were selling 1.5 million bottles annually at 25 cents each. That's $375,000 a year in revenue, equivalent to over 11 million today. After production costs and advertising, they were likely clearing 200,000 or more in pure profit annually. Jeremiah Curtis became a millionaire, and he was just one player in a massive industry. Lydia E. Pinkham Medicine Company grossed $300,000 per year at founder Lydia Pinkham's death in 1883. By 1925, the company peaked at $3.8 million in annual profits. Here's the extraordinary part. The company continued answering letters under Lydia's name for decades after she died, a fraud exposed by Ladies' Home Journal editor Edward Bock, who published a photograph of her gravestone next to advertisements inviting women to write to Mrs. Pinkham. Women would write intimate letters about their menstrual problems, their fears about pregnancy, their marriage troubles. They believed they were writing to a sympathetic older woman who understood their suffering. They were actually writing to a company that employed clerks to send form responses, recommending they buy more product. The personal touch was marketing. The compassion was a con. Dr. Samuel Brubaker Hartman's Peruna earned the Columbus, Ohio physician an estimated $100,000 per day at its peak. $100,000 per day. The product was later exposed as mostly cologne spirits, alcohol, with less than 0.5% actual medicinal ingredients. The Peruna Jag became a standard form of intoxication in southern Ohio and West Virginia. Men who couldn't afford whiskey or who lived in temperance communities would drink Peruna and get drunk on what was supposedly medicine. The Department of Interior explicitly prohibited its sale to Native Americans in 1905, not out of concern for their health, but to prevent intoxication. The Kickapoo Indian Medicine Company employed up to 800 Native Americans, Iroquois, Sioux, Blackfoot, Cherokee, never actual Kickapoo people, to tour with medicine shows featuring scalp dances and war dances. Nearly 100 troops travelled simultaneously by 1890, reaching as far as South America. The shows were part carnival, part theatrical production, part sales pitch. They exploited white Americans' fascination with native culture while selling them products that had nothing to do with actual indigenous medicine. The distribution network was as sophisticated as the railroad lines that carried it. The mail-order revolution, spearheaded by catalogues like Sears, Roebuck and Company, brought laudanum to the most isolated homesteads. The Sears catalogue was known as the Consumer's Bible. Families in rural America ordered everything from the catalogue: clothing, farm equipment, furniture, and medicine. You could flip through pages of seed drills and Sunday dresses and find bottles of laudanum, paregoric, and morphine sulfate available for order. The catalogue was democratic in that way. It didn't matter if you lived in Chicago or in a sod house in Nebraska. The mail would bring your opiates. The introduction of rural free delivery in 1896 exploded the reach of these companies. Before RFD, rural Americans had to travel to the nearest post office, sometimes many miles away, to collect mail. After RFD, carriers delivered directly to mailboxes on farmsteads. A farmer in the Dakotas or a sharecropper in Alabama could order a supply of opiates without ever seeing a doctor or a pharmacist. The package would arrive at the door. No questions asked, no prescriptions required. In towns, the general store and the pharmacy, often doubling as a soda fountain, sold laudanum over the counter. It was as accessible as flour or sugar. A child could be sent with a note and a few pennies to fetch a vial for a parent, normalizing the drug's presence in domestic life. The boundary between food, household supplies, and narcotics simply didn't exist. By 1905, the industry had reached a scale that defied comprehension. $75 million spent annually on patent medicines, millions of bottles moving through the mail, thousands of children dying, hundreds of thousands of adults trapped in addiction, and somehow not a single regulatory bill had passed Congress. How? We need to stop here for a moment because what I'm about to show you changes the entire story. You're probably wondering how this industry operated for so long. How did they block every regulatory bill? How did they keep newspapers from investigating them? How did they maintain this perfect system where everyone knew babies were dying, veterans were addicted, women were trapped, and nothing changed? The answer is a clause printed in red ink on every advertising contract. F.J. Cheney ran the Hall's Catarrh Cure Company. In the early 1900s, he developed a strategy. He added a provision to every advertising contract his company signed with newspapers. It was printed in red to make sure nobody missed it. The clause said this: if any law passes in this state that restricts the sale or manufacture of patent medicines, this contract becomes void immediately. Think about what that means. You're a newspaper editor. Patent medicine companies are your largest advertisers. They represent more revenue than any other category. Cheney just told you, if your state regulates our industry, we pull every ad. Your revenue disappears overnight. Cheney later boasted to his industry colleagues, and yes, there's a record of this. He said, quote, "I wrote to about 40 papers and merely said, please look at your contract with me and take note that if this law passes, you and I must stop doing business." The next week, every one of them had an article, and Mr. Mann had to go. End quote. The patent medicine industry had turned every newspaper in America into a lobbyist. Editors didn't just stay silent, they actively campaigned against regulation. They published editorials denouncing proposed laws as interference with free trade or an attack on personal liberty. They painted reformers as busybodies and government overreach enthusiasts. The journalist Samuel Hopkins Adams would later document this in his exposé, The Great American Fraud. He wrote, quote, "With a few honorable exceptions, the press of the United States is at the beck and call of the patent medicines." Not only do the newspapers modify news possibly affecting these interests, but they sometimes become their active agents. End quote. When North Dakota passed a disclosure law in 1905 requiring medicines to list ingredients like morphine and cocaine, the Proprietary Association of America, the industry trade group, voted to boycott the state entirely. They pulled all advertising from North Dakota newspapers until the law was weakened. From 1879 to 1906, nearly 100 bills were introduced in Congress to regulate food and drugs. All failed, not because the public opposed them, not because the science was unclear, because the patent medicine trust had weaponized the free press against the people it was supposed to serve. Curtis and his fellow manufacturers understood something fundamental about power in the Gilded Age. Control the information, control the market. As long as newspapers depended on their advertising revenue, the truth about laudanum would never reach the public in a way that mattered. But Curtis and the industry had made a calculation that would eventually prove fatal. They assumed the system was permanent. They assumed that the red clause was invincible. They assumed wrong. Because while they were busy bribing editors and killing bills, the demographic profile of addiction was beginning to shift, and that shift would change everything. Victorian society maintained a hypocritical distinction between medical addiction and vice, largely based on the method of ingestion and, crucially, the race of the user. The laudanum drinker was typically white, middle class, or a veteran. They consumed the drug orally as a tincture. Their addiction was viewed as a habit or a misfortune, a private medical issue. These were respectable people who had been betrayed by their medicine. They deserved sympathy and treatment. The opium smoker was associated with Chinese immigrants and the opium dens of the West Coast. This form of ingestion was racialized and criminalized. It was viewed as a moral failing and a threat to white purity. These were degenerates who had chosen vice. They deserved prosecution and deportation. This double standard allowed laudanum to remain legal and unregulated for decades, while laws specifically targeted smoking opium. A wealthy woman sipping laudanum for her nerves was a victim. A Chinese laborer smoking opium was a criminal. San Francisco's 1875 Opium Den Ordinance was explicitly targeted at Chinese immigrants. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first federal law banning immigration based on national origin, was closely linked to anti-opium rhetoric. Politicians argued Chinese laborers would spread disease and crime, weaken the economy, and endanger women, citing opium use and prostitution as evidence. The Smoking Opium Exclusion Act of 1909 banned opium importation for non-medical purposes, but primarily affected Chinese smokers, while white Americans could still obtain prescription opiates. Smoking opium, the Chinese practice, was criminalized. Prescription morphine, the white middle-class practice, remained legal much longer. Even within white America, enforcement was class-based. Surveys consistently showed that respectable women of ailing body and docile comportment escaped criminalization. As historian David Courtwright observed, quote, "When the typical drug user was a young tough on a street corner, hanging out with his friends and snorting heroin, that's a very different and less sympathetic picture." End quote. As long as the face of opiate addiction was a sick old lady or a civil war veteran, this remained a scandal, a tragedy, a medical problem requiring compassion. But by the early 20th century, the demographics were shifting. Working-class men, recent immigrants, urban youth, these groups were increasingly visible in addiction statistics. And when the face of addiction changed, suddenly prohibition became politically viable. The drug didn't get more dangerous. The alkaloid content of morphine didn't change. What changed was who was holding the bottle. This is the ugly truth at the heart of American drug policy. Regulation has always been less about the substance than about the user. The same drug can be medicine or crime, depending on who takes it. But before we get to prohibition, we need to understand how the illusion was finally shattered. How did the public learn what was really in these bottles? How did the Red Claws conspiracy finally break? The answer is literature. And one man with a typewriter who refused to stay silent. Laudanum wasn't just a physical presence in the Gilded Age, it was a cultural force shaping the literature and art of the period. The drug was imbued with a dual nature, the romantic sublime and the gothic horror. The Gilded Age inherited the romantic view of opium as a tool for artistic transcendence. Writers like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Thomas de Quincey had established the archetype of the opium eater. Coleridge's Kubla Khan, famously composed in a laudanum-induced reverie, and de Quincey's Confessions of an English opium eater, published in 1821, framed the drug as an intellectual enhancer. Coleridge began using laudanum in 1791 for rheumatism. By the height of his addiction, he was taking up to 480 grains of opium per day. That's an extraordinary dose, enough to kill someone without tolerance many times over. His letters and journals document the progression from medical use to complete dependence. In 1814, he wrote a confession that captures the moral agony of addiction. Quote, "I have in this one dirty business of laudanum 100 times deceived, tricked, nay, actually and consciously lied." End quote. The poet who wrote about the pleasure dome of Kubla Khan was writing those words while imprisoned by the very drug that had inspired his most famous work. The lie is crucial. He wasn't just admitting to the physical addiction, he was admitting to the moral corruption it caused. De Quincey's influence was even more pervasive. His confessions of an English opium eater became an international sensation. He described opium as giving composure and expanding the inner space of the mind, arguing that while alcohol made a man brutish, opium elevated him. He wrote, quote, "Space swelled and was amplified to an extent of unutterable infinity. I sometimes seem to have lived for 70 or 100 years in one night." End quote. That description, 70 years in one night, captures what made laudanum both appealing and terrifying. It distorted the experience of time itself. Hours could feel like days. Days could disappear in what felt like hours. Users lost their anchor to reality, and for writers that distortion was sometimes creative gold. But it was also a trap. De Quincey's work inspired imitators, including Branwell Bronte, brother of the famous Bronte sisters, who became addicted to laudanum and alcohol and died at 31. This glamorization persisted into the late 19th century, appealing to the Victorian elite who viewed laudanum use as a refined, almost scholarly activity. It was the drug of poets and philosophers, or so the mythology claimed. The reality was that it was also the drug of desperate housewives and dying infants, but the literary class rarely wrote about that. In America, the literary relationship with laudanum was darker. Edgar Allan Poe was often associated with alcohol, but he also had a complex relationship with opiates. His grandmother fed him laudanum as a child, probably for illness or to keep him quiet. Later in life, he attempted suicide with an overdose of the drug. His stories often feature characters in fugue states or catalepsy, mirroring the dissociative effects of the drug. The line between sleep and death in Poe's work is always blurred, just as it was in the experience of opiate use. Charles Dickens took it for coughs and featured opium dens in The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Wilkie Collins, using laudanum for gout, made it an essential ingredient of The Plot in the Moonstone, published in 1868. Collins famously claimed he wrote large sections of the book while in a laudanum trance, unable to remember writing them later. He would wake up and read pages he had no memory of creating, a testament to the drug's power to dissociate the creator from the creation. Bram Stoker's Dracula included maids poisoned with laudanum. Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray sought opium dens where one could buy oblivion. The drug saturated Victorian fiction because it saturated Victorian life. But the definitive literary treatment of Gilded Age addiction wouldn't come until decades later, when playwright Eugene O'Neill looked back at the era that destroyed his family. Long Day's Journey into Night, written in the 1940s but set in 1912, is deeply autobiographical. Every character in the play is based on O'Neill's own family. The character of Mary Tyrone is modelled after his mother, Ella Quinlan O'Neill. And Mary's story is the story of thousands of Victorian women who fell into laudanum addiction through the medical system. Mary was prescribed morphine after a difficult childbirth, the classic Victorian entry point for female addiction. The doctor assured her it was safe. It would help with the pain. She could stop any time. She didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The play dissects the texture of her addiction with brutal honesty. The fog she describes, the sense of being separated from her family by an invisible barrier, the obsession with her crippled hands which she blames on the rheumatism, but which really symbolize her lost agency, her inability to reach out and connect. The desperate, cyclical denial, where she insists she's fine, she's quit, everything will be better, even as her family watches her disappear into the haze again. O'Neill's mother, Ella, was addicted for over 20 years. The family tried multiple times to get her treatment. They sent her to convents and sanatoriums. Nothing worked until much later in her life. O'Neill grew up watching his mother slip away, present in body, but absent in spirit. The play is his attempt to understand that loss, to capture what it feels like to love someone who's been chemically erased. The play exposes the lie of the happy Victorian home, revealing it as a place of isolation, where the cure-all has become the poison that corrodes the family bond. The father, a successful actor, maintains appearances. The sons develop their own addictions and resentments, and Mary drifts through the house like a ghost, trapped between withdrawal and intoxication, never quite present, never quite gone. This was the hidden cost of laudanum that the potent medicine advertisements never mentioned. The slow dissolution of the self, the families watching their mothers, wives, daughters, disappear into a chemical haze. The children growing up knowing their parent was there but not present, physically alive but emotionally gone. Curtis and his fellow manufacturers sold millions of bottles of this dissolution. They marketed it as women's friends and soothing syrups and tonics for whatever ails you, and all the while the literary class was documenting the reality. Coleridge writing about his lies, De Quincey describing his captivity, O'Neill memorializing his lost mother, but literature alone couldn't stop the industry. Poetry and plays might capture the human cost, but they didn't change laws. What was needed was someone willing to name names, publish formulas, and expose the Red Claw's conspiracy to an audience that could demand action. That person was Samuel Hopkins Adams, and he was about to burn the entire industry to the ground. Samuel Hopkins Adams was a journalist for Collier's Weekly, one of the most widely read magazines in America. In 1905, he began investigating the patent medicine industry. What he discovered would change American law forever. Adams didn't just collect anecdotes, he hired chemists to analyze the secret formulas of popular patent medicines. He personally tracked down the cured patients featured in testimonials. Often, he found their obituaries. They had died of the very diseases the medicine claimed to cure. The testimonials were either fabricated entirely or based on temporary improvements before the patient succumbed. He documented the Red Claw's system by collecting actual advertising contracts and interviewing newspaper editors who admitted, often off the record, that they killed stories about patent medicine dangers because they couldn't afford to lose the advertising revenue. He exposed the alcohol content of temperance tonics by having chemists measure it precisely and publishing the percentages. He revealed the morphine content of baby syrups by analysing the formulas and comparing them to known lethal doses. This was investigative journalism in its purest form. Adams was building a case not just for public opinion, but for legal action. Every fact had to be verifiable. Every claim had to be documented. Because he knew the industry would fight back with everything they had. On October 7th, 1905, Adams published the first article in what would become an 11-part series titled The Great American Fraud. It opened with these words, quote, "Gullible America will spend this year some $75 million in the purchase of patent medicines. In consideration of this sum, it will swallow huge quantities of alcohol, an appalling amount of opiates and narcotics, a wide assortment of varied drugs ranging from powerful and dangerous heart depressants to insidious liver stimulants, and far in excess of all other ingredients, undiluted fraud. For fraud exploited by the skillfulest of advertising bunco men is the basis of the trade." End quote. Adams revealed that Peruna's medicinal ingredients totaled less than 0.5%. It was essentially alcohol and water marketed as a cure for consumption. tuberculosis. He documented how consumption cures delayed real treatment while patients died, their families spending their savings on useless tonics while tumours grew and infections spread. He exposed the Red Clause system that had turned newspapers into industry lobbyists, printing the actual contract language and naming the companies that used it. He described babies given soothing syrups containing morphine, then dying in their cribs, interviewing coroners who admitted they'd seen dozens of such cases but felt powerless to act. His writing was visceral. He labelled the soothing syrups baby killers. He called out the manufacturers by name. Curtis, Hartman, Pinkham. He published the actual chemical formulas so readers could see exactly what was in the bottles they'd been buying. He interviewed doctors who admitted they knew about the addiction but felt powerless against the industry's marketing machine and the patients who demanded the medicines they'd seen advertised. One article focused specifically on Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. Adams wrote, quote, "The death rate among infants in districts where the use of these soothing syrups is common is appalling. The mechanism is simple. The morphine paralyzes the respiratory center. The child drifts from sleep into stupor, from stupor into coma, from coma into death." End quote. But Adams wasn't working alone. His investigation was part of a broader reform movement that had been building for years. At the center of that movement was Dr. Harvey Washington Wiley, chief chemist at the United States Department of Agriculture. Wiley had been crusading for food and drug regulation since the 1880s. He understood that without hard evidence of harm, Congress would never act against such a powerful industry. So he created what became known as the Poison Squad. Starting in 1902, Wiley recruited 12 young men, all employees of the Department of Agriculture, to participate in feeding experiments. They were volunteers, healthy young clerks who ate their meals in a special dining room at the department. Wiley's team would add various preservatives and chemical additives to their food, borax, salicylic acid, formaldehyde, and document the physiological effects. The volunteers got sick. They developed stomach problems, headaches, weakness. Wiley meticulously recorded every symptom. The press started covering the experiments, fascinated by the macabre spectacle of government employees being slowly poisoned in the name of science. The Poison Squad became a media sensation, and Wiley used that attention to build political support for regulation. By 1905, Wiley had data showing that common food preservatives cause measurable harm. Adams had documentation showing that patent medicines contain dangerous drugs in lethal quantities. And Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle, published in 1906, exposed the horrors of the meatpacking industry, creating a public outcry that finally overwhelmed industry resistance. The American Medical Association, which had organized its Council on Pharmacy and Chemistry in 1905, paid to disseminate the Adams reporting. They printed his articles as pamphlets and distributed them to doctors nationwide. The AMA had its own reasons for wanting regulation. Patent medicines were competition, undermining physicians' authority, and taking money out of the medical profession. But regardless of motive, they provided crucial support for the reform campaign. The public was horrified. Mothers who had used soothing syrups felt guilt and rage. How many of their children's illnesses had been caused by the medicine meant to cure them? How many deaths could have been prevented if they'd known what was in the bottles? Doctors who had prescribed laudanum liberally faced a reckoning from patients who realized they'd been made addicts. Newspapers that had taken patent medicine advertising were forced to defend their complicity, with some editors writing shamefaced editorials admitting they'd known about the dangers but stayed silent. The industry fought back viciously. They claimed Adams was exaggerating. They said their products were safe when used as directed. They argued that regulation would infringe on personal liberty and free enterprise. They deployed lobbyists to every congressional office. Curtis and his colleagues used every argument, Every lobbying tactic, every threat they had deployed successfully for decades. But something had changed. The red clause only worked when the corruption was invisible. Adams had made it visible. He'd published the contracts. He'd named the newspapers that killed stories. He'd shown the American people exactly how they'd been manipulated. Once the public knew about the morphine in baby syrup, about the alcohol in temperance tonics, about the conspiracy to silence the press, the political equation shifted fundamentally. President Theodore Roosevelt, a progressive reformer eager to expand federal power and rein in corporate abuses, saw an opportunity. On June 30th, 1906, Roosevelt signed the Pure Food and Drug Act into law. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was not a ban. It was a disclosure requirement. Manufacturers were required to label products containing opiates, cocaine, cannabis, and other substances. They had to list the presence and quantity on the bottle. That's it. Just tell the truth about what's inside. The impact was immediate and profound. The secret was out. A mother reaching for Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup now saw the word morphine on the label in plain English. A woman buying Lydia Pinkham's tonic saw the alcohol percentage. A veteran picking up his usual remedy saw the opium content listed in black ink. Sale of opiate-containing patent medicines decreased by 33% within the first year. Not because they were illegal, because people finally knew what they were buying. Some companies reformulated, removing the opiates and replacing them with less effective but legal ingredients. Others simply changed their advertising tactics, now marketing themselves as honest medicines with clearly listed ingredients. Mrs. Winslow's was forced to remove morphine and drop the word soothing from its name, but it continued selling into the 1930s as a reformulated product. But disclosure was only the first step. The medical community began to reckon with its role in the epidemic. Dr. Harvey Washington Wiley, the father of the Pure Food and Drugs Act and chief chemist at the USDA, had built the political coalition through his famous Poison Squad experiments, feeding preservatives to volunteer clerks and documenting the results. Medical schools began teaching about addiction as a disease rather than simply a moral failing. The AMA published guidelines for opiate prescribing. Journals ran articles warning doctors against the casual use of morphine and laudanum. The hypodermic syringe, once seen as a miracle of modern medicine, was now recognized as a vector for iatrogenic addiction caused by the doctor himself. But even as the medical establishment was learning these lessons, they were about to repeat the exact same mistake, and this time, the consequences would be even worse. In 1898, the Bayer Company in Germany introduced a new drug. They called it heroin. The name came from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic or powerful. It was marketed as a non-addictive substitute for morphine and a superior cough suppressant, particularly for children with whooping cough or tuberculosis. The advertisements were remarkably similar to what had been said about morphine decades earlier. Safe, non-habit forming, more effective than the dangerous old drugs. Bayer distributed free samples to physicians. They published glowing testimonials in medical journals. They positioned heroin as the modern, scientific solution to the opium problem. Doctors prescribed it enthusiastically. Finally, a way to treat their morphine-addicted patients. Finally, a cough medicine that actually worked without the dangers of laudanum. They gave it to veterans trying to quit morphine. They gave it to women trying to quit laudanum. They gave it to children with respiratory illnesses. Here's what they didn't know, or chose not to know. Heroin is diacetyl morphine. When it enters the body, it's metabolized into morphine. It's not a substitute for morphine. It is morphine, with a chemical modification that makes it cross the blood-brain barrier faster and hit harder. It was significantly more potent and more addictive than the drug it was supposed to replace. By the early 1900s, the mistake was becoming obvious. Patients given heroin to cure morphine addiction became heroin addicts. Children given heroin for coughs became dependent. The cure was worse than the disease again. This pattern, laudanum to morphine to heroin, each marketed as the safe alternative to the previous drug, each turning out to be equally or more dangerous, this pattern established a template that would repeat throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The pharmaceutical industry had discovered something profitable. You can sell the disease and sell the cure. You can create addicts with one product, then sell them the next generation product to cure the addiction you created. And as long as you have 20 or 30 years before the new drug's dangers become undeniable, you can make a fortune before the cycle resets. The tragedy isn't that this happened. The tragedy is that it kept happening. Morphine to cure opium, heroin to cure morphine, methadone to cure heroin. OxyContin marketed as less addictive than previous opioids. The molecule changes, the marketing changes. The fundamental lie stays the same. But the reform movement faced a fundamental problem. Disclosure didn't address the hundreds of thousands of Americans already addicted. These people had been using laudanum for years, sometimes decades. They weren't seeking pleasure or escape. They were medicating withdrawal. If you cut off their supply, they would suffer agonizing physical symptoms. Some doctors argued for maintenance treatment. Let addicts continue receiving controlled doses to prevent withdrawal while they attempted to taper down. Others argued this simply perpetuated the addiction. The medical establishment was divided. The legal system was about to make the decision for them. On December 17, 1914, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act into law. The act required anyone producing, importing, or selling opiates to register with the government and pay a tax. More importantly, it stipulated that opiates could only be dispensed by a doctor in the course of professional practice. On paper, this was a tax law. In practice, it was prohibition. Treasury Department enforcement agents began interpreting professional practice to exclude the maintenance of addiction. Doctors were arrested for prescribing laudanum to addicts to prevent withdrawal. The courts upheld these arrests. In the Supreme Court cases Webb v. United States in 1919 and Jin Fui Moi v. United States in 1920, the court held that prescribing to maintain addiction was not legitimate medical practice. The legal supply chain was severed. Laudanum, once a household staple, sold next to flour and sugar, was now locked away in the controlled substance cabinet. And then the suffering began. Addicts who had been maintaining their habits through legal prescriptions were suddenly cut off. A woman who had been taking laudanum for 20 years for her nerves, prescribed by her family doctor, was now a criminal if she tried to obtain it. A veteran who had been using morphine since Gettysburg, now in his 70s, faced the choice of agonizing withdrawal or breaking the law. Opiate withdrawal is not fatal, but it feels like death, violent nausea and vomiting, muscle spasms so severe they can break bones, hallucinations, psychological agony that drives people to suicide, and it lasts for weeks, with residual symptoms continuing for months. Some addicts attempted to quit cold turkey. They locked themselves in rooms, endured the shaking and vomiting, emerged weeks later, physically free, but psychologically destroyed. Many relapsed within days or weeks. The pull of the drug, combined with the memory of the withdrawal horror, was too strong. Others found illegal sources, street dealers, corrupt pharmacists, forged prescriptions. The black market that had barely existed before prohibition exploded overnight, and with it came all the dangers of unregulated supply. Unknown potencies, contaminated products, predatory dealers. The same drug that had been available at the corner store was now controlled by criminals. Some doctors risked their licenses and freedom to continue treating their addicted patients. They were arrested, prosecuted, sometimes imprisoned. The medical profession learned quickly that compassion for addicts was now a crime. The message was clear. Let them suffer. Let them quit. Let them die if necessary. But don't help them maintain. The human cost was immense, though largely undocumented. How many elderly veterans died during forced withdrawal? How many women, suddenly cut off from decades of prescribed laudanum, took their own lives? How many people transitioned from legal medical patients to illegal drugs users overnight? The statistics weren't kept because society had decided these people no longer mattered. This is the dark side of prohibition that's rarely discussed. The 1906 Disclosure Law saved lives. It prevented new addictions. It protected children. But the 1914 Harrison Act, implemented without any plan for treating existing addicts, caused immense suffering to people who had committed no crime except trusting their doctors. The system that had created hundreds of thousands of addicts through medical prescription now criminalized those same addicts for being addicted. The doctors who had prescribed freely for decades now faced arrest for trying to help their patients taper off safely. And the manufacturers who had profited from creating the epidemic faced virtually no consequences. International pressure reinforced domestic action. The Shanghai Opium Commission in 1909 and the Hague International Opium Convention in 1912 established narcotics control as an element of international law. The global community was recognizing that the opium trade, which had enriched empires and corporations for decades, was a humanitarian catastrophe. China faced its own addiction crisis. Nearly 1/4 of Chinese men consumed opium in 1906, with approximately 5% of the total population addicted. The Opium Wars of the mid-19th century, where Britain had forced China to accept opium imports, had created a generational nightmare. China was demanding international cooperation to stop the flow. But here's the critical detail that explains why American prohibition happened when it did. As long as the typical addict was a sick old lady or a respectable matron, addiction remained a medical problem requiring compassion. But by 1914, the visible face of addiction was shifting. Working-class men, immigrants, urban youth, people who were less sympathetic to the middle-class voters who controlled policy. The demographic shift made prohibition politically viable. The same drug that had been sold openly for decades was now a menace that required criminal penalties. What changed wasn't the chemistry, it was the user. And that brings us back to Jeremiah Curtis. By the time the Harrison Act passed in 1914, Curtis had been wealthy for decades. He had sold millions of bottles of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. He had watched the headlines about dead babies. He had seen the articles calling his product the baby killer. He had read Samuel Hopkins Adams' exposés, and he died a rich man, respected in his community, buried under an impressive monument in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York. He was never arrested, never charged, never prosecuted, never even sued successfully, as far as historical records show. The families of the children who died from his product had no legal recourse. The system that had protected him through the Red Claws conspiracy continued to protect him until his death. His business partner Benjamin Perkins had a similar trajectory: wealthy, respected, no consequences. Charlotte Winslow, the nurse and midwife who created the original formula, probably never imagined what her home remedy would become. But her name lived on in infamy, attached to a product that killed thousands. The Mrs. Winslow's brand, even after the morphine was removed, continued selling into the 1930s. The company simply reformulated, removing the dangerous ingredients and marketing it as a teething gel. The brand name still had value. Parents still trusted it, or at least enough did to keep the company profitable for another 2 decades. This is the pattern that matters. Curtis built a fortune on addiction and death. He faced no legal consequences. He died comfortable. His monument stands in that cemetery today, if you care to visit. A testament to Gilded Age success. Now let's fast forward to the end of the 20th century. In 1996, Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin with an aggressive marketing campaign. They claimed the extended-release formulation made it less addictive than other opioids. They funded patient advocacy groups. They hired over 5,000 doctors to give promotional talks. They created the Partners Against Pain website. They sent sales representatives to pressure doctors into prescribing higher doses. Internal documents later revealed that Purdue executives knew about the addiction risk. They knew the extended release coating could be easily defeated. They knew that their marketing claims about less than 1% addiction risk were false. And they continued anyway. The tactics were identical to the Gilded Age playbook. Target vulnerable populations. Women aged 40 to 59 received twice as many opioid pills post-surgery as men. Downplay addiction risks in marketing while internal documents showed awareness. Fight regulation through lobbying and funding compliant organizations. Create the appearance of concern while maximizing sales. Purdue even went further. They developed Project Tango, a plan to profit from the addiction crisis they had created by selling addiction treatment. Sell the opioid, sell the cure, an end-to-end pain provider, as they called it. This was the exact model used by the Keeley Institutes in the 1890s, which treated morphine addiction while the industry continued selling morphine. From 1999 to 2017, over 450,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses. Purdue Pharma earned over $35 billion in revenue from OxyContin. The Sackler family, who owned Purdue, withdrew over $10 billion from the company. In 2019, Purdue Pharma declared bankruptcy as part of a settlement with states and families. The Sackler family agreed to pay $4.5 billion over 9 years and give up ownership of the company. In exchange, they received immunity from a civil litigation. No Sackler family member was criminally prosecuted. No executive went to prison for the deaths. The family retained billions in personal wealth. In 2024, the Sackler name is still on museum wings. Their art collections remain intact. They live comfortably. Jeremiah Curtis has his monument in the Bronx. The Sacklers have their museum wings. The pattern holds. 2 epidemics, separated by a century. The same playbook, the same targets, the same lies. The Laudanum epidemic receded through a combination of disclosure requirements, prescription controls, medical education reform, and the arrival of alternative treatments. Aspirin became available in 1899, offering pain relief without addiction. By the mid-20th century, opiates were generally limited to the treatment of severe pain rather than serving as cure-alls. But the critical lessons were clear. Aggressive pharmaceutical marketing creates addiction. Industry will suppress evidence of harm while lobbying against regulation. Vulnerable populations, women, children, the poor, suffer most. And the transition from scandal to crime depends less on the drug than on who uses it. Every one of these lessons was available in libraries, medical journals, historical texts, and archived newspapers by the 1990s. The Purdue executives had access to this information. The FDA regulators had access. The doctors had access. The journalists had access. And yet, historian David Courtwright, author of Dark Paradise, A History of Opiate Addiction in America, an expert witness in multiple opioid lawsuits, has drawn explicit parallels. Quote, "We have been here before. This country was burned badly by the opioid epidemic of the late 1800s." End quote. He identified one crucial difference. Quote, "The wave of medical opiate addiction in the 19th century was more accidental. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, there's more of a sinister commercial element to it." End quote. The Gilded Age manufacturers probably believed their products worked. They may have been willfully ignorant of the harm, but they weren't necessarily malicious. The modern pharmaceutical executives had decades of addiction science, regulatory frameworks, and historical precedent. They knew. And they made a calculated business decision that profit outweighed the body count. The Stanford Lancet Commission projects 1.2 million more opioid deaths in the United States and Canada without intervention. 1.2 million. We are living through a crisis that we had already solved once before. We knew how it started. We knew how it spread. We knew how it ended, and we let it happen again. The greatest tragedy of America's opioid crisis may be that it was entirely preventable. The warnings were written in the death certificates of 19th century infants. They were documented in the medical journals of physicians who watched their patients become bound and servile slaves to medicines they had prescribed in good faith. They were exposed in Samuel Hopkins Adams' articles that named the manufacturers and published the formulas and revealed the conspiracy. But those warnings required someone in power to care more about public health than corporate profit. They required regulatory agencies with teeth. They required a press willing to investigate rather than simply print pharmaceutical company press releases. They required prosecutors willing to charge executives with crimes rather than negotiate settlements that leave billionaires comfortable. In both epidemics, reform came only after the body count became undeniable. And in both cases, the people who profited the most faced the fewest consequences. Samuel Hopkins Adams concluded his 1905 exposé with words that remain relevant. Quote, "Should the newspapers, the magazines, and the medical journals refuse their pages to this class of advertisements, the patent medicine business in 5 years would be as scandalously historic as the South Sea bubble." End quote. He was right, but they didn't refuse, not until regulation forced them to. It took government action, not market self-correction, to end the fraud. A century later, the same lesson applies. The market will not fix itself. Industry will not regulate itself. Profit-maximizing corporations will maximize profit until someone with legal authority forces them to stop. Jeremiah Curtis died wealthy because no one stopped him. The Sackler family remains wealthy because the penalties were negotiated, not imposed. The system that protected Curtis through the Red Claws conspiracy evolved into the system that protected Purdue through lobbying, regulatory capture, and bankruptcy protection. In 1890, you could walk into a store and buy enough morphine to kill yourself without anyone asking a question. In 2005, doctors were prescribing enough OxyContin to create millions of addicts because pharmaceutical sales representatives had convinced them it was safe. Both systems were legal. Both were profitable. Both killed on a mass scale. The difference between medicine and poison has never been the molecule. It's always been who benefits from the prescription. In the Gilded Age, it was patent medicine millionaires. In the 21st century, it was pharmaceutical billionaires. The chemical changed from laudanum to oxycodone. The marketing changed from newspaper ads to medical conferences. But the fundamental equation never changed. Profit over safety. Sales over science. Shareholders over patients. At its peak in the 1890s, 1 in every 200 Americans was addicted to opiates. We looked back at that era and thought we had learned. We built regulatory agencies. We passed laws. We trained doctors about addiction. We created systems designed to prevent it from happening again, and then we forgot. Or more accurately, we decided that the lessons didn't apply when there was money to be made. The monument to Jeremiah Curtis still stands in Woodlawn Cemetery. The Sackler name still appears on museum walls, though some institutions have begun removing it. Both men profited from American pain. Both faced minimal consequences. Both are reminders that in the absence of enforcement, history doesn't just rhyme, it repeats, word for word, death by death. 1 in 200, 3 times worse than we thought it could ever get again. That's the cost of forgetting. That's the price of allowing corporate profit to dictate public health. And unless we finally internalize the lesson that took 50 years to learn the first time, we'll be here again in another century, wondering how we forgot what our great-grandparents knew. The laudanum epidemic ended not because corporations developed a conscience, but because journalists exposed the truth and the government finally acted. The OxyContin epidemic is still killing people, not because we don't know how to stop it, but because we're still waiting for the intervention that history says won't come from the market itself. Samuel Hopkins Adams was right in 1905. We just keep forgetting he was right. And people keep dying while we remember.